Hello, MCU fans! Today we're going to take a look at 36 different dimensions, realities, realms, and planes across the MCU and how they relate together. And I think this is all the more important as we're barreling towards Doomsday, just a year away. So, lots to discuss. Let's dive right in and see what we can find out. We started a new month, so we have a new contest. Be a subscriber, leave a comment. You could win a book or a steelbook. Best of luck. And that means we need to announce our November winners. There were 5 winners to celebrate hitting 30K subs on the channel, so if your name is listed here, go to the About section of the channel and reach out via email or Discord, and I'll get your prize right away. We also have a membership option with lots of cool perks, so you might check it out. Plus, hang around to the end of the video, and I'll talk about the What If Pitch contest on the Discord. Alright, so since we're talking about 36 different dimensions, it's nice to kind of group them together into categories. In particular, we're going to focus on dimensions that are unique to a single universe, meaning it's a one-to-one relationship, and then the dimensions that are unique across the entire multiverse, meaning there's only one of them for the entire multiverse. So we're going to start by discussing the ones that are unique to a single universe, in particular, those that can be reached via magic. Now, we need to discuss something that was very confusing in the first Doctor Strange movie. The Ancient One says, this universe is only one of an infinite number, worlds without end, some benevolent and life-giving, others filled with malice and hunger. Dark places where powers older than time lie ravenous and waiting. Who are you in this vast multiverse, Mr. Strange? So obviously she used the multiverse word, so that makes you think of branches, it makes you think of 828, 10005, etc. But actually, we need to look at what Kevin Feige himself explained in this article, way back in 2016, about the term multiverse in the Doctor Strange movie. So he says, you're going to learn about our interpretation of the multiverse and various dimensions, and that's key. So he says there's parallel dimensions, there's multiple dimensions, and then he gets really clear. Dimensions are not just parallel realities. We're playing as much with the notion of a multiverse as much as alien dimensions, for lack of a better term, than parallel realities where there's a Strange that wears Iron Man armor. We're not there yet. Okay, so he's really being clear. They're not talking about branches, they're not talking about 828, 838, etc. Instead, they're talking about the notion of a multiverse of dimensions right next to our own. All right, so that's really important, and that means that all these dimensions we're going to discuss are basically unique for every single universe, meaning there's one of them in every single universe. All right, so first let's talk about the material plane. That's basically where the characters live, right? In fact, here's Wong and She-Hulk talking about the dangers of untangling the material and astral planes. And here in the Doctor Strange movie, we have the Ancient One saying, you think this material universe is all there is. So all right, we have the material plane. Then let's look at the different dimensions. So first is the astral dimension. And I love anytime someone's astral form is punted out of their body, right? That's just epic. So here we have the Ancient One explaining, for a moment, you entered the astral dimension. So here again, we see Peter Parker being punted out of his body there, and we have Bruce Banner being punted out. And then finally, we have this awesome scene from the first Doctor Strange movie where the Ancient One is basically holding back time because she knows the next moment is her last, as she stands and observes from the astral plane. But of course, not every example of using one's astral form is a good idea. Here we see the Scarlet Witch in WandaVision using her astral form to read the Darkhold. Yikes. All right, so our next dimension is the mirror dimension. Here we see Doctor Strange going into the mirror dimension, and in fact, the Ancient One says, you're now inside the mirror dimension, and the real world isn't affected by what happens here. And of course, we see that throughout the movie, right? During the fights with Caecilius. And then we have this awesome scene with the Ancient One using her powers. I love it in No Way Home when Spider-Man gets trapped in the mirror dimension, but then turns things around and traps Doctor Strange. That was just epic. Then, of course, we see the mirror dimension in Multiverse of Madness when the Scarlet Witch was briefly trapped in it until she managed to get out. So yeah, mirror dimension is awesome. So then we have the dark dimension. Now this one's going to get a little confusing again because Wong explains that Dormammu dwells in the dark dimension. He tells us that it's beyond time, but most importantly, he says Dormammu is on a quest to invade every universe and bring all worlds into his dark dimension. Okay, so if you just take that on the surface, then that would seem that there is one dark dimension across the entire multiverse, and he's trying to pull in all the different universes. But remember, Kevin Feige said we're not talking about branched universes and parallel universes, etc. We're talking about different dimensions. So what Wong is really saying is Dormammu wants to pull all the dimensions into the dark dimension until none are left. And by the way, that includes the material plane, because here we see him invading Earth, right, and trying to destroy it. And then, of course, Doctor Strange heads to the Dark Dimension to cast that spell, Dormammu, I've come to bargain, and really ticks Dormammu off. And this is really key. So this is from the Doctor Strange movie, but you might remember there was a What If episode where we also see him confronting Dormammu. But this was in a branch because in this case, Christine had died, if you might remember from that episode. Really, really good episode. But the key is, this is proof that there is a different Dark Dimension for each universe. And in fact, we saw the Dark Dimension in your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. So this was a different Dark Dimension there. And in fact, we see the Dark Dimension at the end of Multiverse of Madness, and I really want to know what's going on, where supposedly Doctor Strange created this incursion, right? And Clea has come to make him clean it up. So really want to see how that all plays itself out in Doomsday. All right, so for our next set of dimensions, I'm going to turn to the Marvel Studios Visual Dictionary, because that's where we get the names for all of these crazy dimensions that Doctor Strange sees when the Ancient One sends him through a bunch of them, right? So she sends him to the, I'm going to mess this up, but I guess Actinaria dimension? Sure, we'll go with that. So that one was pretty cool. Then we have the Flowering Incense dimension. We have the Grass Jelly dimension. What a weird name. And again, these come from that Visual Dictionary. Then we have the Mandelibus dimension. That one was really funky. And then we actually have two that I'm not sure what picture to show you from the movie. But the book, the Visual Dictionary, tells us that they go to the Quadraverse. And this is at least what it looks like in the comics. And they tell us that he visits the realm of madness. And here again is from the comics. In this case, on the left panel, he's sending the Black Knight into the realm of madness. And on the right panel, you can see those shadow creatures grabbing him. So at least in the comics, the realm of madness is beyond Nightmare's world in the dream dimension. It's where one's greatest fears take on a tangible form similar to that of the fear dimension. So, okay, we don't have any lore about it in the MCU, but that's at least what we learn about it in the comics. All right, so then we have the Nightmare dimension. So this one's interesting. It's not yet been mentioned anywhere in the MCU, but depending on whether you think the What If immersive game is canon, it was mentioned in that. Notice Wong is saying, Wizard, I didn't train for a year in the Nightmare dimension just to be called Wizard. I am Sorcerer Supreme. So yeah, we really, really need the Nightmare dimension to show up. In fact, we need Nightmare himself to show up in the MCU. Then we have the Magenta dimension. This is also not mentioned anywhere in the main MCU, but it's in a tie-in novel, The Hero's Journey. So this book is a prologue to Avengers Infinity War involving Strange being plagued by visions of a tentacled creature named Kalkartho, which was attacking Earth. In an effort to stop the attack, Strange and Wong open a portal to the Magenta dimension to use the bonds of Balzar, trapping the creature. Interesting. So depending on how much you think these books are canon or not, we have the mention of the Magenta dimension. All right, so then we have the Shadow Dimension. This was mentioned briefly in the She-Hulk series when Wong was trying to figure out where to send Emo Blonsky, the Abomination. He says, well, we could send him to the Mirror Dimension. And She-Hulk's like, I don't know what that is, but no. And then he says, Shadow Dimension? So that's it. We have no other information about what it is. But I will say, in the comics, the Shadow Dimension is the place where the Necrosword was forged and is the home of the Shadow Monsters. So that sure sounds a lot like the Shadow Realm, which was mentioned in Love and Thunder. I'm going to bring that up a little later, but I'd really be curious in the comments whether you think the Shadow Dimension and the Shadow Realm are just two names for the same place. All right, so then we have the Witch's Road, which of course turned out to be totally fake, although at least for a time being, Wiccan did create a pocket dimension beneath Westview, so it's worth mentioning, but I'm assuming it's gone and we'll never see it again. And then finally, we have the Western Cortex of Neverish. What a mouthful, right? But that came up during the Ironheart series. It's mentioned to be a parallel plane, and in fact, it's a different realm that they visited, and the reason they visited it is to check out the Hood's cloak, because notice they're experimenting on it to try to learn what form of magic it has. So yeah, those are all of the different dimensions you can reach via magic. So now let's talk about mystical dimensions. So top of the list would be Ta Lo. We learned about that during Shang-Chi, as Wenwu says, have you heard of the legend of Ta Lo? It's a hidden village with mythical creatures and ancient magic. And here's a nice shot of how beautiful it is. And then we also learn that the realm of Ta Lo stretches far beyond the shores of our small village. So it's not just this little area, right? Instead, we have cities that surpass any in your universe. So notice that seems to imply that Ta Lo is unique per universe. And then we have Kunlun. So when asked where is that, Iron Fist explains it exists in another dimension. And here's a beautiful shot of Kunlun. And then Iron Fist drops this crazy statement. He says it's one of the 7 capital cities of heaven. And then he doesn't explain that any further, right? Well, at least in the comics, the 7 capital cities of heaven, also called the 7 celestial cities of heaven, are hidden city-states spread across the world, and every 88 years the cities merge into one, creating the heart of heaven, and they hold a tournament of heavenly cities in which the city sends their immortal weapon to compete. And you can look down below and see the 7, although it actually turns out 8 cities. So I don't think the Marvel's going to go any further with any of this, but still, this theoretically is the lore behind those 7 cities of heaven. And then we finally get the Noor dimension. As Najma explains, in our home dimension, the Noor dimension, we're known as clandestines. And then we see this map showing us how the clandestines are from another realm. It's really cool how it then shows that the 2 worlds do indeed coexist. And then here's another cool image. There's many dimensions around us that we cannot see. And in fact, we learn that behind a veil of Noor, that's what separates our world from theirs. And then we see the rift actually falling apart, right? And the 2 worlds kind of merging. And luckily, Miss Marvel stops that from happening. But also, it's worth noting, the Noor is where she gets her ability to create her hard light powers. So very cool. All right, so now we move to a category that I'm calling extraordinary dimensions because I don't know what else to categorize them as. So the first will be the Shadow Realm. And remember, I mentioned earlier, I kind of wonder if the Shadow Dimension and the Shadow Realm are the same thing, but here we see Thor saying they're in the Shadow Realm. He explains the heavy atmosphere there has a darkness like no other. And of course, we see it here, a really nasty looking place, right? And that was where we got the really cool black and white battle between Thor and Gore. And the only time we saw any color was when their weapons were striking, like this scene with Valkyrie. That was such a cool scene. I think everybody knows this is one of my least favorite movies, but still, this scene at least, and some of the others were really, really good. All right, so then we have Soulworld. I think we all know what Soulworld is, right? That's where the souls went when Thanos snapped. But what's interesting is, I didn't find, at least, that they ever called it the Soul World in the MCU. Instead, we have to turn once again to the What If immersive game, where we have Wong saying, "No one truly knows how Soul World works. The ancients believed it could be whatever you make of it." So, yeah, very interesting that the only place that we got the real name for the Soul World is here in the immersive game. And then we have, and I know I'm going to butcher this, so leave it in the comments, tell me how badly I said it, but the Ginnungagap, I guess, right? Anyway, it is never called that in the MCU, but in Thor the Dark World, when Odin says, long before the birth of light, there was darkness, and from that darkness came the Dark Elves, basically in the comics, they came from this Ginnungagap. So, whether or not you want to consider it canon to the MCU based on just this brief narration is up to you, but theoretically, that's what it would be called. All right, then we have the negative zone, which, once again, is never actually called out in any MCU movie, but based on the comic panels in the Fantastic Four movie, it's certainly being implied, and hopefully we're going to see the negative zone come into play in Phase 7 and beyond. Then we move to the Afterlife Dimensions. All right, so we've seen a lot of these, right? With the first being the ancestral plane. We learned that the heart-shaped herb gives you the strength of the Black Panther, but also takes you to the ancestral plane. And in fact, we saw that in the first Black Panther movie when T'Challa goes there, and of course he sees all the different elders. And then, of course, we saw Shuri go there, and she ran into Killmonger. What an amazing scene that was. So the question is, do we have different afterlives for each universe, or is there only one version of the ancestral plane? Well, I'm actually going to turn to a Saturday Night Live skit to show an example of why I do think there is a unique afterlife for every single universe. So if you want to see this skit, Google Black Panther SNL. It's really funny. But Kenan Thompson, who's hysterical, plays Uncle Mbutu, who obviously loves to grill burgers, although they all taste terrible. But the key is, would you really want to go to the astral plane if there was only one for the entire multiverse and you didn't have an Uncle Mbutu in your universe? You'd have to deal with this dude. In fact, for that matter, you would have to deal with variants of yourself from every single universe. How depressing would it be to get to the afterlife and run into variants who lived a better life than you did? No, I really think there is a unique afterlife for every single universe. So another example of afterlives is Valhalla. Here we have Heimdall saying, "You're very welcome here in the land of the gods." And we see how beautiful, obviously, Valhalla is. And then he says, "Welcome to Valhalla." And then finally, we have the Duat. We, of course, saw this during Moon Knight. And we have the Field of Reeds, which was your final destination. And then we even have the Gates of Osiris. And this is where you could decide, do you want to go forward to the Field of Reeds, or do you want to go back to the material plane again? And of course, we saw Moon Knight do that. And if we're talking about the afterlife itself, we have to talk about the guides to the afterlife, right? So we saw Taweret taking you to the Duat, and of course, we saw Death. So it does make me wonder, are these two competing with each other for customers? Who knows, right? But also it brings up the question, is there a death for every universe or only one version of death across the multiverse? Well, for that, we need to move to cosmic entities. So we're not talking about dimensions now, but still a very important concept of these different entities. So we saw in Guardians of the Galaxy this mural that showed us death, eternity, entropy, and infinity. So that was awesome. And then, of course, we saw Eternity himself show up in Thor Love and Thunder, which, by the way, Eternity's realm, that would be another realm or dimension. And you reach Eternity's realm through the gates of eternity. So this was fascinating because we see all these statues of different cosmic beings. And notice the one on the left, the head got knocked off at this point when this image showed up. So I'm going to superimpose, very poor job of it, I know, but his head back on again. And now I want to put a label for each of these cosmic beings because this is really interesting. So at least according to the wiki, the first one is the one above all. I'm going to come back to that one. There's the Watcher, the Living Tribunal, Eternity, Death, Eon, and Infinity. All right, so the reason I kind of question whether this is really the one above all, it's not mentioned in the movie, right? This is just a theory, but I never thought of the one above all as being a celestial. Really want your comments on that. Tell me if you think this is the one above all or if it's just Ereshkigal, which is honestly kind of what I think. So I think all of these entities, though, are basically one per universe. So in other words, there's not one across the entire multiverse, but each of these exist in each universe other than the Watcher. Put a pin in him. We'll come back to him later. But let's talk about why I think these cosmic beings exist for each universe. Well, first of all, we see that the Celestials are unique per the universe, and they actually created the universe. So this is Ereshkigal in the Eternals movie, but this is Ereshkigal in What If Season 3. And he's approaching, in this case, Agatha and Kingo to ask about the failure of Tiamat rising out of the earth. And of course, this was a crazy episode, right? Where Agatha majorly levels up and even gets into a fist fight with Ereshkigal. That was so cool. But the point is, there's a different Ereshkigal for each universe. So I think if Ereshkigal is unique for each universe, then probably all the other cosmic entities are as well. A couple other examples. Here we see a pruned statue of one of the living tribunals, but it's just a statue in this case. But even more importantly, here we see multiple versions of the living tribunal, and this is when they're going through that crazy multiversal trip in Multiversal Madness. It's right at the very beginning, but I do think this is indicating there's a different living tribunal for every single universe. But here's what's crazy. That means the cosmic entities existed on each of these strands that we saw at the end of Loki Season 2. Isn't that insane? It shows how Loki majorly powered up. He basically brought life back to each of these timeline branches, ultimately by plugging them into himself. But in each of these was a living tribunal, Ereshkigal, death, etc. That's just so wild to me. All right, so now we've covered every dimension and cosmic entity that are unique for each universe. So there's one for each universe. Now we're going to talk about the dimensions that are unique across the entire multiverse. So there's only one of them. So we'll start with Crossroads and Junctions. And of course, you're probably immediately thinking of the Gap Junction. We saw that in Multiverse of Madness, where they said this is the Gap Junction, the space between universes. And here we see America and Defender Strange booking it across one of the paths, and ultimately they're trying to get to the Book of Ashanti, because Doctor Strange hid that here at the Gap Junction. All right, then we have Dr. Selvig's chalkboard, and oh my goodness, there's so much amazing stuff on this. So Dr. Selvig, if you can just kind of get out of the way. Awesome, thank you. So there's three things to talk about here. The first is the Crossroads. All right, so the Crossroads is not mentioned anywhere else in the MCU, so we're going to turn to the comics. And in the comics, the Crossroads is a parallel dimension within the multiverse that serves as a nexus point for multiple different dimensions. And that's why in this Hulk storyline, they punted him into the Crossroads because that was the only place they could contain him. He had gone totally savage, and they didn't want to kill him, but they sent him here instead. All right, and then we have the Fault, which again is not mentioned anywhere else in the MCU, so we have to turn to the comics. In the comics, the Fault is a dimensional rift within the multiverse that exposes reality to multiple alternate universes. And then here's what's really wild. The wiki goes on to say that it can lead to the observational plane, in other words, the place where the Watcher sits. I don't know what to think about that. The wiki doesn't cite the reason why it's saying that, but I'm wondering if they're assuming that that's how Infinity Ultron got to the Watcher. And speaking of that, notice the nexus of all reality. So this one is fascinating. According to Upper Deck trading cards, the place where Infinity Ultron crashed in, to confront the Watcher was called the nexus of all realities. Now, I thought it was the observational plane, and I haven't seen it referred to as the nexus of all realities anywhere else but, these trading cards. But still, I could see that name working. But since we're bringing that up, let's now talk about the observational plane. So, Infinity Ultron blasted through the observational plane. That's where we learned this name. It was in What If Season 3. And of course, they're referring to when he confronted the Watcher, saying the entire multiverse at your fingertips, and you spent all your time up there? So what he's referring to is here, this is the observational plane, and basically we learned from What If Season 3 that you can view everything from here. So, all right, observational plane, nexus of all realities, call it what you will, but definitely this is where the Watcher hangs out. All right, so where is it located? Well, the observational plane is in the fifth dimension, because obviously the Watcher himself is a fifth dimensional being. And in fact, they refer to that in What If Season 3 when they say we're looking at broken pieces of the fifth dimension itself. And then when Captain Carter wants to go there, Storm warns the fifth dimension is not just some other universe, it's a higher plane of existence, which is very true. And that's why we know there's only one of them for the entire multiverse. Then we have the Order of the Watchers, and I'm really bringing this up to point out there's definitely more than one Watcher. I mean, obviously Uatu over on the left, but we learned that there's lots of Watchers, right? In Guardians 2, we see this dude, and he's hanging out with two other of his friends, and that makes me wonder, are these the three evil Watchers we saw in What If Season 3? But one who's not evil, that would be Stan Lee, R.I.P., buddy. He was an awesome Watcher, and of course they desert him and take off. But then we've also seen the Watcher narrating the What If episodes. We saw him show up during Eyes of Wakanda. He's shown up during I Am Groot. And then we have to wonder, is that also the same Watcher checking out the X-Men 97 universe and the Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man universe? It's not real clear how many Watchers there are looking at all these different universes, but at least we do know more than one Watcher exists. All right, so now we move into the generic category I created of extraordinary dimensions. Basically, I don't know what else to call them, but that would include the Utopian Parallel. That's, of course, where America originally came from. There's little America and her two mothers, and Doctor Strange says, "Where is this?" And she explains, home. But notice, she didn't call it Utopian Parallel. We'll get to why I'm calling it that in just a minute. But then she gets frightened by this bee and creates a portal which pulls her parents into one universe, and then ultimately she gets sucked into another. So why am I calling it Utopian Parallel? Well, on Marvel.com, they had interviews when Multiverse of Madness came out, and notice, they say, in the MCU, America Chavez is a young girl from outside of our multiverse, specifically the Utopian Parallel, which is a singular dimension unlike anything we've ever known. So, all right, that means she came from some unique dimension that is the only one across the entire multiverse. And that's why there's only one of her. All right, so then we have the quantum realm. So Janet mentions that Kang was exiled here outside of space and time. But while it's outside of space and time, time does flow in the quantum realm because Janet aged 31 years while she was there. But you definitely have some unpredictable things with these time vortexes because remember, Scott was only in there for 5 hours, even though 5 years happened, in the main MCU. And then the ants seemingly went into a time vortex because they passed through some type of time dilation and they lived thousands of years in a single day. All right, so is there only one quantum realm? Well, I got to go with what's on Marvel.com, where they interviewed Jeff Loveness, the writer of Quantumania, and he said it's basically the basement of the multiverse. It's this connected limbo outside of space and time. And they went on to say, we want it to feel like this real place that's hidden beneath the multiverse. So that naturally raises the question of how do you get a branch in the quantum realm? Because remember the Janet that got the zombie virus, that happened when she was in the quantum realm. Well, my guess is that when you branch, you just don't see your variants. You're out of phase with them. Sort of like we saw when Scott got near the multiversal core. He started to see his variants, right? He saw every single choice he could make existing all at once, even including when he was a Baskin-Robbins worker for life. So yeah, you basically see your variants if you're standing next to the multiversal core. So that means that Janet from 616, the main timeline, wouldn't have even been aware that a branch was formed with a variant zombie Janet because they were out of phase with each other. So why do I think Jeff Loveness made it so it's the basement of the multiverse? Well, I think that's because obviously Janet is from 616, but I don't think this Kang came from the 616 universe. So remember, He Who Remains met the other Kangs, right? And then they all started fighting and getting mad at each other. And obviously these three were involved in that battle as well as this guy. And this is the one that gets exiled to the quantum realm. But remember, He Who Remains is from 616, so this Kang is from a different universe. And therefore, if there was more than one quantum realm, he and Janet never would have met. So just my theory on that. So then finally we get to the TVA. So we have the Time Variance Authority offices, which we know are massive, right? And we know that B-15 is in charge, and then here's basically the main group that's running the whole thing. But we know that wherever they're located, they're not tied to any one universe. In fact, wherever they are is very strange, because when Loki asks, how long have you been here? Mobius says, I don't know, it's hard to say. Time passes differently here in the TVA. So we know that time passes, it works, but it's just very, very different. I mean, there has to be time, or otherwise they wouldn't be told to limit their lunch breaks to 17 minutes. But wherever they are, they're not bound by the constraints of any one universe. In fact, we see they're monitoring several universes. We see they're monitoring 616 during the Loki series, because they stamped that on like everything. But then we see in Deadpool and Wolverine that now they're monitoring 10005. And presumably, they're monitoring all the universes, 828, 838, the Spider Bros, you name it. And obviously, during the Deadpool and Wolverine movie, we saw Paradox running rogue, but ultimately, it's the same B-15 that showed up and, whipped him into shape. All right, then we have the Void. So we learn that the Void is a metaphysical junkyard, according to Reed. And we also learn that it's where the TVA sends people that don't play nice with the rest of the multiverse. So why am I saying there's only one Void? Well, lots of reasons. Number one, we see things from several universes pruned there. We see a Shatari spaceship. We see the bridge from the last stand of the X-Men movie. And we see helicarriers. But also we see all these characters that were pruned. And obviously Blade is from a different universe than Elektra, who's from a different universe than the X-Men. So yeah, there's only one Void and everybody keeps getting pruned there. And then I think the most clear evidence is when Alioth shows up in Deadpool and Wolverine, Deadpool hilariously says, oh yeah, that's the Alioth from Loki Season 1, Episode 5. But basically he's saying it's the same Alioth and there's only one Void. And then as the final bit of proof, we have Cassandra saying, I'm going to use your little time ripper and I'm going to destroy this universe and the next and the next and the next until all that's left is the Void. So obviously one Void, even though there's tons of universes. All right, so then we have the Citadel at the end of time. And we do get that official name because Miss Minute says, welcome to the Citadel at the end of time. And of course, who's hanging out there but He Who Remains? Now, after he's killed, we obviously see everything going nutso. And ultimately, the throne there, that was one of the few things left, is what Loki sits upon when he brings in all the different timelines, reanimates them, and now he's kind of stuck there. Although I'm betting it's Dr. Doom who's going to come after him. So there's only one Citadel at the end of time, but obviously it's not constrained by any one universe. It's outside of the universes. And then finally, we have that crazy Kang Stadium. We're not sure where this thing is located, but wherever it is, it's outside of all the different universes where they're able to observe everything going on. And of course, all these crazy Kang variants are whooping and hollering, and I'm betting they're about to all get killed by Dr. Doom during Doomsday. All right, so there we go. We've talked about every universe that's unique to a single universe and is unique across the multiverse. And I'll go ahead and break them out now. So here is all 25, they're in alphabetical order, that are unique to a single universe. And here is all 11 that are unique across the multiverse. So now I want to know how right you think I am or how horribly, horribly wrong I am. I mean, this was not an easy video to put together. I tried my best. Hopefully I got it right. But if not, let me know, because I love to read and respond to everything. And don't forget, December contest, be a subscriber, leave a comment, win a book or a steelbook, and there's the membership option in case you're interested in that. Plus, I promised I would talk about the What If Pitch contest on the Discord. These are the rules, but the TLDR is join the Discord and give us either the title of your episode or the title and a synopsis. Notice the deadline is December 11th. Also, we have our Doomsday Countdown Watch, every day listed here at 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. Eastern. We watch a different movie or show as we head towards the 2026 release of Doomsday. So we have 25 vendor members across the globe, conversations 24/7, and I'll leave a pinned comment so you can join. Also, if you don't mind, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. You can check out more content, and we'll all continue to enjoy the ever-growing, the ever-changing Marvel Cinematic Universe.